The lands between has no shortage of lost ancient civilizations. Their grand ruins and mysterious disappearances tease our minds and make us wonder who they were and what role did they play in shaping the history of this world. But there is one group in particular whose tragedy has been foundational to the game's narrative. I speak of course of the Eternal City of the Nox, a group of ancients who shares a profound connection with the Greater Will, the ultimate deity of the Golden Order, as it was their betrayal of it that ignited a conflict with the very stars, the consequences of which reverberates through the ages to this day. Today, we will be exploring the truth surrounding the circumstances of their destruction and unveiling their secret hidden origins. This is the second video in a series where I try to set the building blocks for my interpretation of the full story of Elden Ring, the emancipation theory. So, if you have not watched my previous video where we explore Marika, her reasons for shattering the Elden Ring, and the fact that she carries with her the will of the Eternal Cities, then I highly encourage you to do so. And with all that being said, enjoy! The Eternal Cities are the underground settlements of one of the most important factions in the world of Elden Ring. The Nox, as they are called, are described as a cold-blooded race whose design and actions intertwine deeply with the history of the lands between and the Golden Order. From their black marble cities, they became a civilization whose advancement in sorcery, metallurgy, and artificial life can be felt and observed in many of the cultures of the surface. Rituals and concoctions such as the celestial tears, the puppet drought, the mimic tears, and the artificial albinorics all have their roots there. However, delving deeper into their history unveils a revelation. The Eternal City was not always buried beneath the earth. Every alchemical and occult endeavor of the Nox ultimately exists to serve a singular purpose: to bring about the Age of the Stars, the culmination of a millennia-long quest born from their exile and destruction by the Greater Will. For the story of the Nox is that of betrayal and retribution, as evidenced by the relic known as the Fingerslayer Blade. The description reads, "This blood-drenched fetish is a proof of the high treason committed by the Eternal City and symbolizes its downfall. Cannot be wielded by those without fate, but it is said to be able to harm the Greater Will and its vassals." Long ago, the Nox committed a grave sin, and as punishment were banished under a false night sky. That sin is the high treason mentioned in the item description of the blade, which stands as undeniable proof of their aggression towards the Greater Will and his vassals. The description also implicitly tells us that the Eternals were originally loyal to their rule and the order of the Elden Ring, which makes their betrayal echo with the latter actions of Marika and Ranni, who both, in their own way, carry the legacy of the Eternal City. So far, I have been using the term destruction and banishment for the Eternal City interchangeably, and the reason is that they both describe the same event. Let me explain why. Astel, the bastard star, are the calamity that brought ruin to the Nox. With the falling star beasts and the stone lords, they constitute a group of lifeforms from outside this world who emerged from meteoric impact. Described as a malformed star born far away in the lightless void, Astel is the most powerful of these beings, a creature suffused with the magic of the stars and possessing gravitational powers of cataclysmic scale. It is with this power that it is said Astel leveled the Eternal City and stole their night sky, and is the means through which the Greater Will punished them for their sin. While it is understandable why some people might view these as two separate events that struck the Eternals, a closer look suggests a different interpretation. The confusion stems partly from how the English text describes the incident. It uses the term banishment when referring to the punishment given out by the Greater Will, and destruction when discussing what happened with Astel. Even the description of the remembrance of the natural born says that Astel destroyed an eternal city and took away their night sky, which many seems to see as a good fit for the nameless eternal city, which lies in ruin without a false night sky over it. Now, as funny as it is to imagine Astel bullying the Nox and stealing their night sky after they were already banished, this distinction is just a quirk of the English translation and the usage of flowery language. The apparent distinction between banishment and destruction isn't really present in the Japanese text of the items relating to the topic. For example, the word used to describe the ruin of the Eternal City in the Fingerslayer Blade, which relates to the betrayal of the Greater Will, and the word used in Eternal Darkness, which relates to Astel, is actually the exact same in Japanese. In the same vein, the Nox armor, which talks about a banishment at the hand of the Greater Will, also just mentions their destruction in the original text. What is expressed in the Japanese text is something a bit tricky to translate perfectly in English, but the idea is that their destruction led to their banishment, or another way to say it is that they were destroyed towards the underground. You can see how it comes off as awkward in English, so ruined and banished works perfectly fine as translation if we keep the context in mind. But ultimately, the picture painted by the game is as follows. We have multiple references to the destruction of the Eternal City, each implicating either the Greater Will or Astel, both with connotations of confining them underground, but are only ever given one reason for their destruction, that is, the assassination of the Fingers. So unless given ample reason to the contrary, the natural conclusion would be that they constitute the same event. And so the way the Greater Will has banished the Eternals and confined them underground isn't through some supernatural curse or edict, but through a physical bombardment and assault by the stars themselves. When the sky falls over your head, your only recourse is to take shelter underground. And then, the infamous stolen night sky is a figure of speech for denying them the ability to walk on the surface under the stars they worship, now confined underground with nothing but an imitation. As for the nameless Eternal City, though left in disarray, actually bears no hint of having been attacked by Astel or meteors, as the game has been very consistent in leaving behind environmental hints when it is the case. The presence of a falling star can be spotted a few ways. First and most obvious would be the presence of a crater bearing a meteor in it. Notably, you can see what they look like in various places, like in these sites with star callers who desperately scavenge for the fragments can be found, or the divine towers, which are adorned with meteor on their inside. But a surprisingly less known thing is that they can be found in mines. In fact, all the mines in the lands between are digged around a deeply buried gigantic meteor, whose impact in ancient time is the source of crystals, glintstones, and smidden stones alike. If no meteor can be directly spotted, the items like gravity stone chunks being found around an area are a good giveaway, as they are explicitly shards left in the wake of a strike. The nameless Eternal City does not have any of this, nor is there a meteoric life form in any close proximity. The reason it doesn't have a false night sky is simply because it is uninhabited and was probably long abandoned even before it started to sink and the erdtree's root overran the place. But perhaps the true reason as to why it can be difficult to accept the notion that Astel are actually an instrument of the Greater Will is simply the perceived schism that exists between the archetypes they each represent. One is the stars in the night sky, and the other is gold, grace, and the order of the Elden Ring, magic versus incantations, intelligence versus faith. But the reality is that these things are only superficially different, and as categories are only constructs of the cultures in-game. It's not that there is no difference in their effect and properties, but rather is that on a fundamental level, these are not so different. After all things can be conjoined.
Our art draws upon the powers embedded in glintstone. But what is the nature of such power? Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while glintstone contains residual life, and thus the vitality of the stars. It should not be forgotten that glintstone sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein, a fact lost on most sorcerers these days.
As the best teacher Selia explains, glintstone crystal is the ancient star amber housing their vitality, something very much similar to the golden crystal amber which houses primordial life. So, consider this for a moment. What is the only single confirmed physical action taken by the Greater Will regarding the lands between? Well, that would be sending a golden star that carried a beast on it. That's it. sending a meteor which brought with it the Elden Beast, a literal cosmic dragon who also makes use of the same star magic attacks as Astel. The Elden Beast and Astel are similar in multiple ways, and the gold is the fundamental difference between them. And granted, it's a very important difference, as gold is what gives life, gold commands the very stars. Gold is why the Elden Beast is the game's namesake, and why Astel is called a malformed bastard star. But nevertheless, they are more similar than they are not. This twist around the shared origin of both the holy and arcane is a very common From Software trope found in many of their games. But the point is that the Greater Will using meteors to destroy whatever civilization he wants gone isn't any different from a practical standpoint from what he did when he sent the Elden Beast to the lands between. In fact, aside from allegedly commanding the Two Fingers, sending meteors is the only thing we know it can physically do, which is exactly what I believe happened to the Eternal Cities, but also Farum Azula, the seat of the previous order, when they were forsaken in favor of Marika when she was chosen by the Fingers as the new god and vessel of the Elden Ring. You can watch my video on the Gloamite Queen and Marika's ascension for more context here. It also remains unclear if the Greater Will is using these space bugs as a rampaging destructive force or if they are actually agents at its service. Though the presence of Astel in front of the only entrance to the Moonlight Altar, as if guarding Ranni's Two Fingers who is hiding there, makes me wonder if it's not the latter case. Talking about the altar, it must have been a place of great importance to the Carians. Yet there we find the Cathedral of Manu Celeste destroyed by what seems to me like a small star shower, based on the starlight shards littering the ground. With the Two Fingers being based there, I cannot help but see this scene as his handiwork after him and Ranni became openly antagonistic. It almost acts as a sort of small-scale reenactment of what happened to the Eternal City, the Fingerslayer blade and all included. Something else that is interesting about this tendency of the Greater Will to throw rocks at the planet is that it indirectly shows us just how little direct control it has over the land. It doesn't seem to have the ability to directly do anything in a particularly nuanced or discerning manner. The fact that it rules through emissaries and vassals, the Fingers and the Elden Beast respectively, as well as the fact it sent the Elden Star to this world, are all indications that the Greater Will is not present.
Well, you managed to return. You know what this means. The erdtree has spurned you. The Fingers remain still, shaken by this turn of events. They are busy consulting the Greater Will. When they are finished, the Fingers will again offer their guidance. But thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass. No matter for me, but you. How will you ever manage to wait?
When the Thorns of the Erdtree deny the Tarnished entry after defeating Morgoth, we find the Two Fingers attempting to contact the Greater Will in light of this unexpected outcome. But Enya explains that it might take thousands of moons. Something to keep in mind about the Two Fingers is that they communicate in a few ways, but most importantly they use light. The ciphers they create are quite literally made of light, and the helms created by the Nox to prevent the Fingers meddling are helmets made of mirrors which blocks and reflects light. Funnily enough, this makes the Two Fingers literal living antennas, sending and receiving signals from the beyond, and so the implication of them taking so long to contact the Greater Will says something of just how far away it really is. So far in this video we have discussed how and why the Greater Will destroyed the Eternal City, as it is what will help us unravel the biggest secret they still hide. What I am about to propose in this part of the video will challenge our very understanding of the history of the lands between, and will reshape and recontextualize our perception of what truly is the Eternal City as we journey back to the very beginnings. Earlier I said that if the nameless Eternal City was indeed destroyed by meteors, then there would surely be signs of that in the environment. I wasn't lying and I still stand by that, but here's the catch. None of the Eternal Cities show sign of having been destroyed by Astel. And the reason for that, plainly speaking, is that the Eternal Cities as we know them, meaning the black marble cities inhabited by the Nox underground, are not the quote-unquote true Eternal City that fell to ruin at the hand of the Greater Will. This might seem outlandish at first, but there is actually a myriad of hints and a very consistent effort by From Software to communicate this through the environments in the game. As we don't have to walk very far to find exactly what we are looking for. The smoking gun for what the Greater Will did is found in the Dynasty ruins. Commonly called by the community the Ul or Old Civilization, they are referred to by the item descriptions as the Ancient Dynasty. Their ruins, frequently found around the Eternal Cities, have a distinct ancient architecture and are marked by the omnipresence of this nameless figure. Described as a civilization that flourished long before the erdtree, their scattered remains suggest that, at some point, it was vast and influential, spreading across the lands before somehow finding their way underground. What fascinates about the Ancient Dynasty is that their ruins, unlike the Eternal Cities, present compelling evidence that they were destroyed by Astel. An assertion that is supported by several key points, each reinforcing the notion that falling stars played a pivotal role in the downfall of their society. First and foremost, the presence of the numerous malformed stars scattered throughout the ruins strongly suggests a direct connection between the two, which is further reinforced by the wing of Astel being found there, a relic from the creature which directly mentions its assault and destruction of the Eternal City. But even if the presence of the beast itself isn't enough to convince you, then we only have to turn our attention towards the ground, as the land on which this civilization once stood bear unmistakable signs of Astel's destructive capabilities. The presence of these star colors, for example, signifies a land struck by meteors, and the Ul Palace ruin is actually one of the only places where we can acquire gravity stones, which are shards left in the wake of a strike. Both of these facts are also consistent with what we can observe by taking a closer look at the claymen who infest the ancient ruins, as the various rudimentary weapons and projectiles used by them are all made from meteoric ore, which they seemingly scavenge from the area. Now, with each of these things on their own representing telltale signs of falling stars, it is hard to imagine their simultaneous presence to be a coincidence. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, all these things are confined specifically to the section with dynastic ruins and can never be found in the more recent cities of the Nox. The discrepancies between what we would expect to see from the Eternal Cities and what we can actually observe in-game don't end there either, as we must also consider that if the black marble cities of the Nox were truly destroyed and buried underground, there should be some evidence of their presence on the surface, where they were initially constructed before betraying the Greater Will. However, this is not the case. There is no Nox ruin to be found above ground. Yet in contrast, the ruins of the Ancient Dynasty are present both above and below ground, which is in line with what one would expect from a buried civilization. So, what is going on here? On one hand, the game is quite explicit in telling us that the Eternal Cities were banished underground by the Greater Will, but on the other, everything seems to point to the Ancient Dynasty being the actual subject of his retribution. Well, though it might seem like a contradiction at first, the answer is actually found in the close ties between these two groups. Let me explain. The name Eternal City itself carries multiple meanings. However, one in particular is of interest to us, as it is a reference to the real-world Eternal City, Rome. It is a name that came from the people's feeling that the city would endure throughout the ages with the rise and fall of civilization. A name now more fitting than ever for a city whose modern buildings and streets intermingle with its more than 2 millennia old imperial remains. It's this contrast, this open-air display of history, the new being built on top of the old, that was one of the core pillars behind the design of Elden Ring's Eternal Cities. For what we can observe in-game is the consistent overlap between the cities of the Nox and the much more ancient Dynasty ruins, to the point where we can even see the Nox actively using them and even tending to them. The potential implication here is that the Ancient Dynasty remains are to the modern Eternal City what Imperial Roman ruins are to the city of Rome. Though this argument holds up quite nicely, I would like to leave evidence based on real-world inspirations and parallels to the likes of Quelag and tarnished archaeologists who are much more knowledgeable on those topics. Which ultimately brings me to the Clayman. The Claymen are a group of enemies exclusively found in the underground ruins. Through their ashes, we learn that these mudmen are what remains of priests who sought oracles in service of the ancient dynasty. We will talk more about these oracles when we talk about fate in a couple videos from this one, but for now, what matters is that these fellows serve as our missing link. As the spells used by the Claymen to read fate, oracle bubbles, and great oracular bubble are actually night sorceries. In Elden Ring, spell sigils are tools used by the developers for world building and were designed primarily as signifiers of both magical and cultural lineage. The night sorceries have their roots in the eternal cities, and as such, their usage by the old priests of the ancient dynasty can really mean only one thing. What all of this shows is that the ancient dynasty is the historical foundation and the cultural heritage upon which the modern eternal cities underground were built. In other words, the ancient dynasty are the predecessors of the Eternals. Thinking about it, even the existence of the Clayman itself could be seen as a proto-version of the Silver Tears, a primitive form of artificial life crafted from earth rather than metal. And this is where things fall into place. The reason the dynasty seems to have been the one destroyed by the Greater Will is because they are the quote-unquote true, original Eternal City mentioned in the ancient history of the Nox, while the more recent black marble cities were constructed by their descendants, which is consistent with what we can see if we take a closer look at the architectural features of the modern Eternal cities. The inverted towers of Nokron hanging from cave ceilings, the dams and aqueducts built around underground rivers, and elevators connecting to the surface are all structures that suggest an adaptation to subterranean living, which in combination with the lack of Eternal City remains on the surface shows us that the black marble cities are in fact a post-banishment development. The ancient dynasty being the ancestors of the Nox has a few implications. Last video I postulated that Marika wasn't just from the Eternal City, but rather was actually their founder based on cut content describing the Nox as descendants of Marika. And so, in light of their connection with the ancient dynasty, we can postulate two things. First, Marika was from the ancient dynasty and as such is a witness to their previous rise against the Greater Will with the Fingerslayer blade and their subsequent destruction. Second, much like the Eternals, the ancient dynasty were Numen in some capacity, and as we will see in the next video, might in fact be the first Numen who came from another world. By the way, if this made you think there is no way Marika is this ancient, just wait until I date her even further back next video. But for now, we actually already have something in-game that ties Marika to the ancient dynasty, and it's actually her #1 favorite boy. Mohg, you guessed it. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, son of Marika and Godfrey, who got thrown in the sewers with his twin brother at a young age, actually subtly gave away the origin of his mother's lineage.
Oh, so that's where the so-called Lord of Blood was hiding himself, eh? A fitting little squat for that deluded maniac to bleat about the revival of his precious dynasty, while he turns our fellow tarnished into bloody fingers. Let him stay there. That way, his delusions will remain as they are, distant and unattainable.
Many have attributed Mohg squatting in the ancient dynasty mausoleum as a way for him to jumpstart his new Mohgwyn dynasty, with the general idea that Mohg is simply a poser and generally has no relation to them. However, I always found it intriguing how Gideon specifically says that Mohg is raving about the revival of his dynasty. Establishing a new line for a new empire is one thing, but if his aim is to revive the already existing dynasty, then that means that he is explicitly claiming to be of their royal lineage, as a dynasty is a sequence of rulers from the same family where leadership is passed down through hereditary rules. Now, maybe Mohg is just completely deluded, but if he is not, then it means he is aware to some extent of his bloodline and its ties to the ancient dynasty. But either ways, there is one more thing I would like to touch on today. That is the ramification of the fate that befell the Eternal City. After all, their banishment wasn't a singular destructive event, but rather a plight that has kept the Nox underground, lest they decide to challenge the stars. General Radagon, the one once hailed as the mightiest demigod, challenged the sky in a historical event called the Starscourge conflict, and, in an unfathomable display of might, claimed a shattering victory over the fallen stars. To this day, even as he is consumed by millennia scarlet rot, his sanity long gone, he remains the force that's halting their movement and consequently keeping fate in stasis. The question as to why Radagon would do something so absurd is commonly talked about in the community, and speculation range anywhere from him wanting to stop fate for whatever obscure plot to simply grabbing for glory to match his idols of war, Godfrey and Radagon. However, regardless of potential ulterior motives, the game already has the answer written for us on the sword monuments near Redmane Castle. It reads, "The Starscourge conflict. Radagon alone holds Selia secure and stands tall to shatter the stars." Selia is what could be described as an eternal city settlement on the surface. Called the Descendants of the Eternal by the sage Gari, their close ties to the underground cities of the Nox are hardly a secret. The town of sorcery was the reason behind Radagon's actions and the centerpiece around which the Starscourge conflict revolves. The stone monument as well as the Starscourge heirloom make it clear that the town was being attacked by fallen stars. Selia exemplifies the so-called curse that the Greater Will has imposed on the Eternals, and is one of the reasons why I have never really clicked with the idea that they summoned Astel upon themselves, as what we can observe through them is a systematic targeting of the race, and one that has been ongoing up until relatively recently, which is something that strongly indicates intentional punitive measures rather than an accidental calamity. But Selia's plight eventually ended with Radagon shattering the constellation and halting their movement. But what I find interesting about the story of Radagon and Selia is that it is such a twist of fate. When Radagon took on the role of protector, he sought to acquire the means to defend the town from its assailants, and to do so he studied under the tutelage of an alabaster lord. But before the aim of his studies shifted towards a grander purpose, Radagon originally came to Selia with the goal of studying gravity magic so that he could simply keep riding his beloved horse. But the irony here is that it might have been the town's predicament with the stars that also indirectly brought them their savior. Living on the surface, constantly facing the threat of falling stars, has profoundly shaped the culture and technology of the Selians, which can be seen in their craftsmanship and magical practices. For example, the Olivinus Conspectus, one of the most prestigious research subjects of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, was actually started by a Selian sorcerer, which many of you might recognize as the primeval sorcerer Lusat. The Conspectus itself focuses on shooting star sorceries with spells such as Star Shower and is in essence the study of meteors, which is also the reason it has been constantly attracting mages from Selia ever since its establishment. The Selian craftsmen also probably made weapons out of meteoric ore, as they are highly effective against life forms born of falling stars. We know the Moonveil katana, made of glintstone, was the work of a Selian craftsman, and though it is not confirmed, so is probably the meteoric ore blade, another katana found in the region, and of course Radagon's swords. This approach of fighting fire with fire is what ultimately made Selia the place to learn about gravitational sorceries, and why we find so many related sorceries and items in its ruins and surroundings. But it also speaks more broadly about the Eternals' tendency to copy and assimilate the power and aspects of their enemies. But we should end it here for today. So in short, here is my proposition. The ancient dynasty of the Numen are the original Eternal City who served and betrayed the Greater Will, resulting in their destruction and burial by the very stars they worship, a curse that still plagues their descendants to this day. From the depths, they founded the Black Marble Eternal Cities as we know them and started plotting and preparing for the day they would finally be free. In the next episode, we will be talking about where it all began, from the arrival of the ancient Numen, the founding of their dynasty, and the role they played in shaping the primordial world under the influence of the Greater Will, as we will finally dive into the crucible of primordial life and the infamous Great Tree. So, in order not to miss it, be sure to subscribe, liking the video, and all of that is always greatly appreciated. And with all that being said, bye bye!